Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar. I am just going to give it a few more seconds so that people can join from the waiting room. I'm going to ask you all to please keep your cameras off. Just start with that. Okay, so we're going to get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is going to be a great webinar. It is using leverage to promote treatment compliance, striking a balance between compassion and limits. It is a topic that I think is really, really important and really relevant to all parents, because when your kid has an eating disorder at some point or another, you have to use leverage. And it's really important to know how and when to use leverage, because it's not just using leverage, it's using leverage wisely. So Efrat is really an expert on this, which is why I invited her to come and speak with us today. And just, again, housekeeping rules. Just please keep your camera off. Please keep your mic off. And if you have questions, you could just drop them in the chat box. We will get to the questions at the end. We're not going to have a lot of time for questions because I sent Efrat some questions from the community beforehand, and she had a few of her own that she's anticipating you will ask. However, if you do have questions, throw them in the chat box. And I also want to let you know that Efrat graciously offered to prepare a handout. She is not going to use slides. She is going to speak, but she's going to provide a handout. So you don't have to feel like you have to furiously write notes as she's speaking. Focus on the webinar and you'll get the handout afterwards. And now without further ado, oh, one more thing, sorry. One more thing, which is that we are doing an impact survey, because it's really important for us to know who's using our services, what services they're using, at what point they're finding F.E.A.S.T, how they're finding F.E.A.S.T. It would really help us, whether you're a provider or whether you're a parent, if you could fill out the impact survey so that we can know how to better serve our community. So I'm going to drop the link in the chat, and when you all have time, if you can answer it, that would be great. And now I'm going to hand over to Efrat.
Thank you so much. So yes, I'm F.E.A.S.T. Lipton, and I am a licensed therapist and also a certified eating disorder specialist. And I've been working in the field of eating disorders for my entire career, which has been almost 35 years now, over 30. And I'm the co-founder of Atlanta Center for Wellness, which is an outpatient private practice, and we have wraparound care. We've got a full-time pediatrician who just does the oversight and assessment and management of eating disorders, and then an entire multidisciplinary team like a psych NP who used to work inpatient at a psych hospital, and lots of therapists and dietitians. So we take a team approach, and we have a program called COPE, which is a comprehensive outpatient program for eating disorders with meal support and groups. And then the highlight of my week is that I run a free support group that's called F.E.A.S.T, and it's on Zoom. So if any of you want to join us, you're welcome to. And in that group, we're very lucky because we have what we call veteran families. And these are families who have loved ones who have been in long-term recovery, and they very graciously keep coming to the group, and they come to offer their wisdom and their support, and to talk about, mistakes they made and things they learned through their journey. So that's wonderful. And one of the things that comes up a lot in the F.E.A.S.T group is this question of using leverage. It's a big question, a big topic that we discuss. A long time ago, Judy did ask me to do a short snippet for the skills training. And so I did do that, but I was so happy to be invited to do, a longer webinar today, because I do think that it is a very important and complex issue. So I wanted to spend more time. So the first thing I want to do is just define what we mean by using leverage in the eating disorder world. So when we talk about using leverage, we're talking about utilizing any power and influence that you might have as parents or loved ones to impact the person who has the eating disorder, to hopefully help them make behavioral choices that would achieve the desired goals or the recovery behavior. So you're basically trying to find things that matter to the person that you can utilize to direct their behavior and to influence their choices. So the first thing I want to do is to just talk about some common barriers that people tell me get in the way of using leverage. And I've sort of classified them as emotional and logistical barriers. And then I'm going to talk about how you can address some of those difficulties and fears and uncertainties. And then finally, I'm going to give you some techniques and some communication skills that will hopefully increase your confidence so that you can start using leverage, hopefully even after today's talk. So when we talk about the common barriers, one thing that I hear a lot from families is that, you're just so heartbroken that your loved one is going through the eating disorder and you see them suffering so many losses already that the idea of having them miss out on anything else or taking anything from them is so difficult. So it's just pushing all the buttons of empathy. You certainly don't want to punish your loved one for having an illness. And a lot of times having consequences or using leverage can feel like that. Parents talk about being afraid that they're going to alienate their loved ones, that they might shut them down and cut off communication, and get them angry. And so they kind of stay away from using leverage. They might be afraid that their loved one is going to rebel and start maybe escalating their eating disorder behaviors, which obviously is the opposite of what you want to do, or even start introducing new behaviors like cutting or suicidal behaviors. So that's a huge fear. And then sometimes people feel like they're just torturing their loved one who's already in pain. Like they're already going through so much. I don't want to do anything that upsets them. And then in terms of the behavioral or logistical barriers, a lot of people believe if their loved one is just allowed to do what makes them happy, then they're going to have an easier time eating. And a lot of times you will hear promises of that. If I will eat 100% tomorrow if I can go to the sleepover tonight. It's just, it's easy to get pulled into believing that maybe if my loved one is just psychologically feeling good, they will start naturally eating and getting better. Sometimes people are dealing with two households, and in the other household, there isn't really support of the eating disorder recovery, or it's not taken seriously. And so there might be a feeling of, well, this is futile. Why bother? There's no point in doing this if it's not going to happen in the other household. For some people, it seems like there's nothing to use as leverage. It feels like the only thing your loved one really cares about is the eating disorder. So why bother trying to use leverage because nothing's going to work? And then sometimes you realize, yes, I know my child does care about other things, but I don't even know what's appropriate to use. So I'm going to be listing some of that. And then with financially independent adults, loved ones who either are older children or partners, life partners, or maybe siblings, the barrier might be not knowing how to use leverage or if it's even appropriate in that population. And then the last thing is just general fears about, am I getting this right? How do I do it? How do I get started? How do I know if I'm making a mistake? People just have, a little bit of a crisis of confidence there. So I'll just start by saying I am a big fan of using and talking about leverage. And I loved what Judy said, using it wisely. I think that not only is it acceptable and helpful, but I think oftentimes it's actually kind because it's really supporting and helping the person who's struggling. And we're going to go through that, and I'll go through a little bit of the barriers and give you some tools. So hopefully you'll feel more equipped. So, using leverage can be so hard when all you feel is compassion and fear. It's like the empathy is firing on all cylinders in your body. And our instinct, especially as parents, but any loved one, is to protect the people that we love, protect them from pain. Sometimes with eating disorders, it can almost feel like the treatment is what's painful. Sometimes when they're using their eating disorder and they have a lot of control, they might even seem happy, and it's not until you start pushing them towards the recovery goals that you see some discomfort. So, it's difficult when you feel like you're the one imposing pain on them. You want to provide for loved ones, not deprive. You don't, obviously want them to suffer or want to feel like you're punishing them for an illness or alienate them or shut them down. And certainly you don't want to escalate the situation. So all of this is churning inside of you as you're having to figure out how to start using the leverage. It makes it very, very difficult. But I just want to remind you that the truth is that human beings, we all need limits and we all crave structure of some kind. Kids especially need boundaries to feel safe, and they need to have a calm and trusted adult who can hold those boundaries. What I talk about in my F.E.A.S.T group is that we want to try to get equal parts compassion and limits. If you're all in your compassion, you may not be able to set a limit because you're feeling so much empathy that you can't really muster it up. But if you're just one of those people who's much more structured and setting rules and setting boundaries, maybe even rigidly doing so, you may not be sounding kind, and you might sound a little bit more cold, and that might put up the defenses of your loved one. So you've got to have the equal parts. And sometimes when I have, two parent families will come in and say, well, is it okay if I hold all the compassion and my partner holds all the boundaries? And I'm like, no, it has to be equal parts in both people. And I think you should have compassion for your loved one. I really, if I feel like people come in and they're just in their anger and frustration, as much as I understand that, I try to help them find the compassion because they have suffered losses and they are missing out and they are in pain, and this isn't their fault. I also have a tremendous amount of compassion for you because you are struggling with all those same things. I think you can communicate that compassion through your words and your tone and your demeanor while still holding the limits that you have to hold to keep your child safe or to keep your loved one safe. So I like to tell people to think of it this way. Your loved one is fighting an internal battle every single day. They have to fight this eating disorder, and you don't want to leave them fighting alone. You want to help arm them and give them some tools to fight the eating disorder. So in addition to things you might provide, like you might take them to coping skills classes and they learn CBT and DBT and ACT and all those wonderful things. They're so helpful. They really do help your loved one figure out what to do when that voice starts kicking in, and they can really fight the eating disorder voice. So those are great tools. But in addition to that, you can give them reasons to stand up to the eating disorder and things to fight for. And that is extremely helpful. When they have to choose between their eating disorder and something else in life that matters to them, they grow stronger and their eating disorder weakens and diminishes. So introducing leverage can sort of help your loved one justify a recovery choice because, it will give them some other desired outcome. It's like a motivator. This is actually a reason that sometimes when people go into treatment, all of a sudden they will start eating. And families are often very mystified by this. They're like, wait a minute, what the heck is going on? I've been trying to get my child to eat for weeks or months or, sometimes even years. And all of a sudden they go into a treatment center and they're eating 100%. And, as much as it's a relief to parents that this is happening, it also can kind of feel bad. Like, what was I doing wrong? How come I couldn't get my child to eat? But, the important difference is that now that they're in treatment, they sort of have an excuse to eat, or even more accurately, they have permission to eat. The eating disorder voice is a bully. It's going to be strong and loud and kind of push your loved one around. So if they can now say to themselves, okay, well, there's no choice, I guess I've got to eat. There's nothing else I can do. I've got to eat to get out of here. It gives them that permission. Now I can do that. If they're in their kitchen alone and they're thinking about, should I get my snack or not get my snack? The eating disorder is, putting a lot of pressure on them not to. So the leverage really helps them with, okay, now I've got something to fight for. Without that, they're very vulnerable. So hopefully that can help you think about it in a way that's more compassionate. And this gives them, a lot of stamina and a lot of momentum at the beginning of recovery. And it really strengthens the recovery muscle. A lot of times in the Fed group, people ask me, like, well, is it okay if they're recovering just because they want something or just because they don't want something? They're avoiding a consequence or they're trying to get something. And I always say, sure, because it's very temporary. This is just how it is at the beginning. At the very beginning of treatment, especially if it's restricting anorexia, the weight restoration or weight stabilization, the nourishment, keeping the food in, getting the food in is what is most important. We want to get the brain to heal. So, if they do that for whatever reason, we can deal with those other things later. But right now, we want to just get them started. And I also think that once they are eating and their brain heals, they may become more recovery minded and they actually may want to keep eating because they feel better. They can tell that they feel better. So just think of it that, like, at the very beginning, any choice that kind of pulls them away from the eating disorder and towards life is a win. And it doesn't really matter, what the rationale is. Even honestly, even if it's to get more control in their life, even though we know that that's a big focus for people with eating disorders, that's okay because they're still making the recovery choice. For those of you who feel like it's mean and cruel to take more away, I would really urge you to reframe that and to think about it as now you're protecting your loved one. Your loved one really may not feel strong enough or have the clarity of mind at this moment to make the recovery choice for themselves. If you think about it, it's sort of like it's not even fair to ask them because their thinking is impaired. They're very obsessive and very distorted in their thoughts right now. So they really cannot be the ones to make the decision. They need you as their parents to be the calm and rational ones until they can get there. So it's not cruel at all to do this to them. I mean, you think of it almost like it wouldn't be cruel to take keys away from someone who is drunk and say you can't drive, because in that moment you can think clearly and they can't. So it's really the same as that. You might have that flash of empathy and think, oh, I don't know if I can do this, but you just have to go forward with that reassurance that you are really helping them. I tell people you're literally saving their life. And what you're doing is you're protecting your loved one and setting boundaries with the eating disorder. Sometimes it helps for people to separate that. I am there. I believe that everyone's struggling with an eating disorder. There's even a small part of them. It may not show up very much, but there's usually a very small part of them that wants to get better, doesn't want to be ill. If their eating disorder is, very, very severe, it may be that, that part barely ever can get any leverage going within the person. So it's really protecting them to set these boundaries and to be the one who says, I'm gonna speak to that little part that wants to get better. Now, your loved one may stonewall you. I'm thinking that, with most people that I work with, that I can think back in my recent history, there's some kind of a negative response when leverage comes into the picture. You either get the cold shoulder, which can feel bad, or your loved one can lash out, which is more common, sometimes even threaten or use violence. And this happens especially when this is a huge shift in the parenting. Most eating disorder personalities, not all certainly, but most are pretty compliant until the eating disorder comes around. They're kind of pleasers. They want to follow the rules and do the right thing. And probably for a lot of you as parents, you didn't really have to set a whole lot of structure for those kids. They were taking care of things on their own, doing their homework and, doing all the things they needed to do. And suddenly you have to parent them in a very, very different way. So you're not used to it and they're not used to it. And, you might be sitting home on a Friday watching a family movie, and then all of a sudden you realize it's snack time and you're like, oh, I don't want to, disrupt this. This is like a nice evening with the family. It just might not feel worth it to start trying to use the leverage because you don't want to cause the disruption at home. But the eating disorder recovery really, really needs that consistency. It can be such a slippery slope when you start to let go of the standard that the person needs to eat consistently. So if they're threatening to do things either to hurt themselves, or if they're acting angry and it's, starting to escalate your anxiety, just dig really, really deep, and don't underestimate the power of your relationship with your loved one. I want you to remember some of this, not all of it, but some of it is testing the limits of your resolve. They really want to see, are you going to hold the line if I make it really difficult for you to do so? So the last thing you want to do is let their behavior control your behavior, because then they will learn that, okay, if I do that, you'll back off. And we don't want to, start that pattern. So just reassure yourself that you're doing what's needed. And I can tell you from running this F.E.A.S.T group for almost 25 years now, loved ones come back over and over and they will tell me that the person with the eating disorder, when they do get into recovery, thanks them later. They say, I so appreciate that you stood by me, and I can't even believe how ugly I was to you, and you just kept doing the right thing. So you may be lucky enough to hear that from them. It may take a while, but usually we do hear that. So, if you do see any regression when you're starting to use leverage and they might seem like they're getting more depressed or more anxious, just recognize that that's probably really temporary. And if they do start using other behaviors like cutting, you can use leverage around those behaviors as well. So, you can tell them the same that I'm teaching you to do with the eating disorder. You can say you have to be demonstrating safety, for all aspects of your body, not just feeding yourself, in order to have these freedoms in life. So you can use the leverage for that as well. You have to try to resist getting pulled into the belief that your loved one's temporary mood or even their mental health right now in this current moment supersedes the recovery goals. This is kind of a no pain, no gain situation. I tell people, I would say that there's probably been never a person in the history of the world that's ever gone through recovery for anything, not just an eating disorder or addiction, but like even surgery or an illness. You do not go through recovery without some discomfort. There is going to be discomfort in recovery. So there has to be some radical acceptance about that. You're doing this for the greater good. You're doing it because you want your loved one to have a long, full life without the eating disorder. The eating disorder needs to be challenged, and the person needs more reasons to get better. So, just kind of hold on to that. Okay, now I want to address the logistical barriers. So, the idea that like, well, gosh, maybe it's wise to let my loved one do all the things that make them feel good, and then maybe they will want their recovery. It's very, very easy to fall into that trap. We so want our kids to have a normal life, right? I mean, that's the whole reason you're doing all of this. The reason that you're bringing them to all their appointments and you're going through the agony of sitting with them through every meal and all of that is because you want them to have their life back. So you might have that little voice inside of you that's like, well, maybe if they can just go to the football game and go to prom and be with their friends, they'll just want to be a normal kid, And so you get pulled into that. But I can tell you, after, like I said, 30 plus years of doing this, eating disorders just don't work that way. I wish it were that easy, but that's just not how it goes. The eating disorder is going to hold on as long as it can. We're in the South in Atlanta, obviously. And so I always use the analogy of kudzu. I didn't even know what kudzu was when I moved here from New York. But, kudzu is the stuff that wraps around the base of a tree and strangles the tree. And I always use the analogy that the eating disorder is like kudzu. It starts small and then it just keeps wrapping itself around and it doesn't want to let go. So the eating disorder is going to hold on as much as possible. And your loved one, that's, sort of been taken over by the eating disorder is going to try to have as much of their normal life as possible with the eating disorder. So you really do need to create choice points for them. That is incredibly important. it actually helps them to build the recovery muscle as they are grappling with the choices that they have to make. So if they're going back and forth internally, I want to go to the football game, but my mom gave me a really challenging meal and she says I have to finish it. Do I want to go or don't I want to go? Should I eat it? Shouldn't I eat it? They're going back and forth, and some part of them is developed. I say to people, at least you're in the struggle when you do that, when you're fighting back. Oftentimes the eating disorder talks, the person listens, but now you're giving them reason to fight internally. They're not always going to make the recovery choice. There are going to be times when they say, I don't care about the football game. I just won't go. I'm not going to eat. In the moment, I want you to know it's okay. It is, you don't have to get angry, and you certainly do not have to get into a power struggle with them. It's part of the process. Recovery is not going to be perfect, as you all know, probably by now. So, don't get into a power struggle with them. Take the wind out of their sails. Just simply look at them and say, that's your choice. I wish you, of course, weren't making that choice, but it is your choice. And then, go forward. Arm them with the reason to fight for the eating disorder and give them something that can give them permission to eat, but then let them do some of that battling. And I will say sometimes the things that kids want to do, like go to a game or go to rehearsal, there are other kids involved and they're like, hey, where have you been? Why haven't you been at practice? You're our star, whatever. Why haven't you been at rehearsal? And so it can actually put some peer pressure on them to do the thing that they need to do to get there, which I think is a good thing. Okay, with the two household families, I want to say, it's obviously very difficult when when one household doesn't buy into the seriousness of the eating disorder. And I'm not going to lie, that's not an easy situation. I work with many family systems like this. I would say, first of all, don't give up. And there may be ways to shift the person. I actually just recently had a breakthrough like that. So there may be ways to shift the person who might doubt the severity of the eating disorder. I have noticed that in high conflict or contentious divorces, sometimes it's not really that they're fighting the treatment or even the reality of the eating disorder. They're just fighting their ex. Anything their ex asks them to do or suggests that they do, they push against. So it may be that you have to get them in front of the treatment team or some objective, person to talk more about what needs to happen at their house versus you being the one to say, hey, listen, I've been doing all this reading and I've found out all of these things and this is what we have to do. If it's coming from you, they won't do it. You might have to get legal support, especially if you're the one who has the power of attorney over the medical. You may have to at least have somebody mandate that they go to a few sessions with either the eating disorder specialty pediatrician or therapist, and that can really have an impact. So if it's not pushback and kind of fighting against you, if it's just ignorance, maybe on the person's part, maybe they haven't spent all their time reading and getting the resources that you have, don't be afraid to send them links and suggestions of books or tell them about the F.E.A.S.T group. Hey, I've gone to this group and it's been really helpful, or about the F.E.A.S.T. F.E.A.S.T has so many resources. So you can tell them about those resources and just say, hey, this has been helpful to me. You can't dictate that they do it, but you can say, if you care to look at it, this has been really helpful. But even if they won't budge after all of that, I would say don't really worry about what you can't control and just focus on what you can control. So, if you spend too much time focusing on that other household and what's going on there and what's not going on there, you're going to lose sight of the eating disorder focus. You don't want to make it known to your child that you're frustrated with their other parent. You just want to kind of keep doing what you're doing. The eating disorder loves to split. So I think, if you just kind of calmly and with confidence go about your business and say, well, this is what we're doing here in this house, or this is what your treatment team recommends. So this is what we're going to do. Practice radical acceptance about what's going on in the other household. And I think the person with the eating disorder will see your calm assurance that what you're doing is the right thing. And at least half the time they're getting that structure. It's not ideal, obviously, but I do think it is possible to recover even in imperfect conditions. So if recovery is being infused somewhere, it's helping. That's what I hold on to. Okay, in terms of the question of when it seems like nothing is there to be used as leverage, like nothing matters to the person, or I just don't know what to use, like I don't know what's appropriate. I would say this is like the number one reason that people tell me they don't use leverage. As a family therapist, and maybe if you have a parent coach or something like that, I think I try to help families really look carefully and closely at that. I think sometimes your loved one will say and act like nothing else matters to them, partly because they don't want you using leverage, so they act like they don't care about anything else in life. Sometimes they're calling your bluff. I've had kids who are in my office and they say, yeah, well, my mom says I can't go on that school trip. And I'm like, oh, you were talking about that and really looking forward to it. How come you're not upset? And they'll say, oh, I know they're not going to actually really keep me back. So they may not really take you seriously. So I would just get curious about, this issue of there's nothing else that they care about. There's always something. Even if that something is like avoiding a consequence. It may not be that there's something they want, but there may be something that they don't want to happen. So that can be helpful. You might be really surprised once you start using leverage to find out that there are a lot of things your loved one actually does care about. So, and sometimes you might have to think out of the box and use things that would not be considered normal consequences. And by the way, with leverage, these are not natural consequences. These, again, with leverage, we're trying to use anything that influences the person to make a different choice. It doesn't have to connect. So I have a family right now, and I got permission. Any stories I tell you today, I got permission from the people. Not going to use names or anything identifying, but this family has discovered that using makeup is a huge, you know, leverage that is working for them. So basically, their daughter loves makeup. She loves to go on TikTok and learn how to apply her makeup and all of that. And so they have told her that in order to get her makeup in the morning to put it on for school, she has to eat breakfast first. She has to first have breakfast, then she gets her makeup. And then for the rest of the day, she's got to be eating 100%. If she doesn't, they will take one component of the makeup away, like a mascara or a foundation. So the next morning, they'll start over. If she has breakfast, they'll give her the makeup, but it'll be minus the pieces she lost the day before. And she'll have to earn those back by eating to completion the rest of the day. This has turned her around. She was refusing meals and now she's not. So it's not coming without a battle or without a struggle, but it is working. And I just want to say that, at the beginning, I was like, okay, makeup, that's another thing that's all about appearance. Do we really want to bring that into an eating disorder recovery? But this is what I'll say about that. Like I said earlier, what we care about at the beginning is eating and being very consistent with that and keeping the food in, depending on what the behaviors are. We want to contain the eating disorder behaviors. And I feel like everything else we can deal with down the road, body image, self-image, all of that we can deal with later. Right now, we're just trying to get their brain back online. And down the road, they may not even feel the same way once their brain is healed. So some other effective things when thinking about what to use for leverage, the low hanging fruit is electronics. A lot of times parents are reluctant to use electronics because they feel like their loved one's already isolating and they don't want to separate them from friends. And I know that that's really hard as parents, but I hope it's hard on your loved one as well. And that they say, well, I don't want to be separated from my friends either. And so maybe they will eat the meal. Lots of kids eat their meals to get their electronics. It happens. So it can be very helpful. Using the car is important, especially if the person has any medical instability. You really have to tell them that they have to be they have to be eating to drive a car because that becomes dangerous if they're not. So that actually is a logical consequence. But these kids really do love their independence and their freedom and their privacy. And so the more that you can tie that to recovery, the better. So sometimes the thing that the person might be attached to that you can use as leverage might seem or feel cruel. So there's a mom who I have worked with, and she ended up having to use books and reading materials as leverage with her son. And, this was really, really hard for her because he does not have a lot of friends. The social world has been cruel to him. And this is his escape. It's a harmless escape. He reads a lot. And so she just felt like, I can't take this from him. And I said, you're not taking it from him. He can have his books. He just has to eat his meal and then he can have his book. So I reminded her that she's just creating a choice point for him. So now that's what he does. He will, eat his meal, then he gets the book from that time till the next eating opportunity. And then he can keep the book if he does the next eating opportunity. If he doesn't, he loses it until the next eating opportunity. And so it's just always giving him a little bit of that incentive. There are some kids who abhor therapy. And so I've even used not coming to see me as leverage. And that's actually been really effective. And the way I see it is if your kid is eating 100% and they're not acting out in the eating disorder behaviors, I'm not as concerned that they're not coming to therapy. The whole point of this is for them to get their life back and continue on their life. Now, sometimes after they do get some recovery, they actually get interested in therapy. So that's always nice when that happens. But if not, I'll say they don't have to come. I'll use the time for parent coaching. That's fine. It gives them a sense of control and it gives them a message that the way out of treatment is to comply with treatment, which I like. So now some kids I have are the opposite. They love therapy. They would come see me 5 days a week if they could. And they love coming and talking to me and they love, just opening up, but they're not really making behavioral changes. So for those kids, I will tell them, like, I'll use the relationship as the leverage. And I'll say, I'm kind of expensive because I'm a specialist. You could go to a generalist therapist. If you're not here to work on your eating disorder, you don't need me. And I have to save my spots for people with eating disorders because there aren't a lot of specialists like me in the world. So they'll say, well, no, I want to come see you. And I'm like, okay, then you have to work this recovery program. And that has worked for a lot of my clients. Using school as leverage is highly effective and sends a very, very, very powerful message, but it is a lot trickier for parents to follow through with, I have found. It kind of, first of all, seems counterintuitive because, we're trying to get these kids to have their lives back. So why would we take away school? That's such a part of their normal life. It's really hard, especially if your loved one academics are a really big part of their self-esteem. Maybe it's one of the few things that they feel good about themselves because of. So it's really hard to think about taking that away. I have a lot of discussion with parents about this one. But I will say that if your child really cares about their academics and school, then, using school as leverage is really effective. And by the way, it also does tell them, wow, my parents are actually willing to keep me back from school for this. Like, you are really prioritizing health. And if you thought about it, if any other illness, cancer, or anything else were on board, school would be the last of your concerns. You would be thinking, what do we need to do to get them well? They'll catch up with school. So you want to kind of send that same message. And also I tell people, your kid's not going to be successful long-term in school if they're not well fed, even though somehow miraculously a lot of my clients can maintain good GPAs. I think they're not really absorbing later. They'll tell me when they're in recovery, like, I don't even know how I did it. They really don't remember everything that they've learned. But even, whether or not they seem to care about school, I would say that, you do want to consider going to school when your loved one is impaired. Do they have the resources internally to do that? You have to be pretty well hydrated and well nourished to go through a whole day that is taxing on your brain and your body. So you really want to weigh, am I expending all this output and, undoing what we're trying to do, getting the input in? So it's just something to think about. But you can use like setting the expectation that the child eats breakfast in order to go to school in the morning and then has to have lunch in order to continue the school day. Um, Eating lunch with peers versus like with parents or a school counselor can be a huge, very helpful leverage to use, especially if you are monitoring all the other meals that your kid is doing and they're not gaining weight and the dietitian and everybody says, they're on enough um, calories that they should be, then I would get suspicious that maybe the 1 or 2 times you're not with them that they're eating, they're probably not getting their full amount. So if you tell them you have to make progress in your appointments and we have to hear that you're making improvements in order for you to be able to have lunch with your peers at school versus leave and come have it in my car with me, that can be very effective. And then for parents of young adults, with going off to college, you really want some demonstrated recovery before you send your loved one off to college. And there's a lot of things out there. There's some college readiness tools and articles you can read. Your treatment team can help you set up a contract. But keeping the standards of what you expect for the person to be able to go off to college is really helpful. And again, this is not punishment. You're not punishing your child. You're not holding something back and depriving them and go to school. It may be that they just go, campus where they're being their treatment team or their supervision. It might be that they have, or
Fred, I think your internet connection isn't so stable.
live campus but come home for meals. I've even department their child if they can. Oh no. Um, is that any better?
Yes, now it is.
It is? Okay, great. Okay. I don't know where you lost me.
Probably about a minute ago.
Was I talking about college?
You were starting to talk about college, so why don't you just go back to that?
Okay. So basically just I was saying that you want to set some standards for going off to college. And there are lots of things out there like college readiness tools. The treatment team can help with a contract. You really want to see a demonstrated recovery before the person goes far away. They're going to be walking a lot on campus. They may not have the treatment team that's familiar with them. So you don't want to send them off until you see demonstrated recovery. And all of this is not for punishment, it's for safety. And I was saying there's some workarounds, like maybe your child goes to school first locally and lives near home and can still utilize their treatment team, or maybe they come home for meals, or they can do online schooling for the first semester or something like that. It doesn't have to be all or nothing, but you definitely want to make sure that your child is safe to go off to college. A lot of people in the F.E.A.S.T group say to me, well, my child is 18, so what can I do? I can't really use leverage with them. And I'm like, well, who's paying for school and their car and their spending? And, 99% of the time, it's you guys, it's the parents who are paying for all of that. So I don't want you to think that just because your child turns 18, you no longer have leverage. You certainly do. And again, you're not punishing them. You're trying to promote their safety. So you're not going to invest in their, going off to college somewhere if they're not even healthy to do that. You're going to first invest in their health and their wellness. So a lot of this, with parenting, you have to be all in. You have to really, recognize that there's going to be some short-term discomfort, but for long-term, benefits. So if all of this that you try isn't really working, it might be that treatment ends up being the bottom line of leverage. And I just want to remind you that no one has failed if this happens. It just means that this particular illness is needing more than you've been giving it. And I try to tell people, think about it, if you're in PT and you have an injury and it's not healing, your provider might say, well, now we've got to move to to surgery. And it's not that you failed PT, it's just that the injury was severe enough that it needed a more serious intervention. So that's the same thing with treatment. And you can talk about it like that with your loved one. You know, you can frame it in a compassionate tone and just say, we've tried everything we know to do, and we aren't seeing a change. So if we don't see that happen within the next week, you know, if we don't see a behavioral change and more compliance from you and buying into this treatment, then the next step is we're going to have to do a higher level of care. So again, you're using it as leverage. You're not using it as punishment, but you are saying that will be what we need to do next. If none of that still budges your loved one, then you might end up needing to focus on using relationship capital, which I'm going to talk about next. And for non-dependent, independent loved ones who do not count on you for financial support, it becomes really important to use relationship capital. It's probably about the only thing that you do have to fight the eating disorder. So when we talk about relationship capital, what we're talking about is just like the trust and emotional goodwill and influence that you have built up over time in your relationship with your loved one. And this is for everybody. It's not just for non-dependent adults, but in every relationship, we have relationship capital. On some level deep down, our loved one really does know that you care. They know that we care about them. Your loved ones know that you care about them. They know that you have their best interests at heart and that you want to keep them safe, even if it doesn't seem like that on the outside, because they're fighting against everything you're trying to do. And they also really care about how this eating disorder is impacting you. They may not talk about that either, but the eating disorder uses that against them and makes them feel a lot of shame. So in using relationship capital, the first thing you have to do is you have to take an honest reflection, on your relationship with your loved one. Do we have a strong, trusting relationship where my child values my input or my loved one values my input? Have I historically been supportive and non-judgmental and been a safe place for them to come emotionally? If the answer to those questions is no, then you might have to spend some time investing in building up that relationship capital and doing that without bringing the eating disorder recovery into it. You're not going to be able to make an ask of them until you have built up some of that relationship. But if you ask yourself that question and your answer is yes, I do feel like we have a strong relationship, then you can move forward, and you need to lead with empathy and curiosity. In the eating disorder world, like when we're doing interventions, we always say use an invitational model versus a confrontational model. Well, certainly with non-dependent adults, it becomes imperative because they don't have to be in recovery if they don't want to. It's their choice. They're living their own life and they're not needing anyone's permission. So the decision about whether or not to get better is theirs. So you're not coming at them trying to persuade them or confront them hard. You're just trying to be curious and ask them how they're doing, and really listen to the answer. Don't interrupt, don't try to fix. I always tell people when you try to fix, it sends the message that the other person's broken. So you don't want to try to fix, you just want to listen. And you can use phrases like, I've been thinking about you a lot. Can you help me understand how you've been feeling lately? I've noticed some things that concern me, and I just want to understand what this is like from your perspective. So again, you're using really non-threatening language and just kind of being there. There's something in psychology we call motivational interviewing. So if your loved one is talking about other frustrations in their life, like, oh, I can't find anybody good to date, or I haven't gotten that job promotion, you can ask a question, like a strategic question, like, are you feeling like there's anything that's getting in the way of your goals? Maybe they will start to talk about, I feel tired, or I don't have a lot of energy, or maybe they'll talk about something adjacent to the eating disorder, depression or anxiety. I give you a hint that you can start talking with them about that topic. You want to gently name what you see without judgment. So you can use the relationship capital to talk about your concerns from a place of love. You can say, you may not see it this way, but I've noticed that you seem really exhausted or depleted or withdrawn. And, if the person has been struggling for a long time with an eating disorder, you can say, this reminds me of other times in the past where you've been struggling. Or if you've just seen them maybe losing weight and you're suspicious that they might have started on the path of an eating disorder, you might say, I see some things that worry me. And I know sometimes these things can happen when you're not taking good care of yourself, and see if you can open the door to them talking. And you can tell them a little bit about how this is impacting you. It hurts me to see you in pain. I know you're strong, but this seems like a lot to carry alone. That kind of language. Again, using your relationship as a way in. And you can share your own vulnerability, and let them know that you're scared and that you don't know what to do and you're not sure how to help. I think that vulnerability opens the door for more connection and reduces defensiveness. You want to definitely offer your loved one choices, not ultimatums, especially since they're an adult. That this is completely their choice whether or not they want to get better. So you might say something like, would you be willing to meet with someone just once? You don't have to commit to more than that, but I'm happy to find the person, or look for people online, or help you find people. So you can offer your help and support and maybe suggest something that doesn't feel too overwhelming. Maybe like small agreements, like, would you be willing to check in with me weekly because I'm worrying about you? Or, can we look together online and see what resources are out there, even though you're not ready to take that step? Anything that they agree to builds some momentum. And also you want to stay the course. Using this relationship capital means that you stay consistent and calm and available no matter what. Even if they continue to reject your offers, you don't withdraw your love or withhold your emotional support. You just stay the course and hope that eventually something might get through to them. And then the last thing that you do that is very powerful and sometimes necessary is that if their behavior becomes so self-destructive that it's affecting your well-being, you may have to set some pretty serious relational boundaries. And so something like that might look like, I love you and I will always be here for you. I'm not abandoning you, but I can't stand by and watch you hurt yourself. Therefore, and then you would put your boundary, I'm not going to be able to have meals with you anymore because it's too hard to watch you go through a meal and not eat. Or I can't let you into our home when we're not home. I had an adult child who was going over to parents' house and binging and purging. And so they had to say, we need the key back, which was uncomfortable. It's their child. But they said, you're welcome to come here anytime when we're home, but we just don't want this to be a place you come to binge and purge. She was leaving because her partner was home. So it was giving her like sort of this place to go and act out. So they didn't want to enable. So, all those kinds of things. You might say, we can't have holidays together. We can't go on vacation together. It's hard to see your loved one in a bathing suit when they're withering away. So all of these things, they protect you, but they actually also provide some long-term benefits for the person, because if they keep coming up against boundaries, it's hard to continue without, reflecting on what this is doing in their lives. So again, the boundaries are not about trying to coerce the person to change or manipulate them. They're really meant to protect you more than anything, and then, not enable, but you're not just trying to like manipulate them to change. Okay, so the last barrier I want to go through is just the I don't know what to do or how to say this or where to get started. And so I always tell people you don't get a user manual when you get your kids, and you certainly don't get one when you have an eating disorder child, although the FBT manuals are pretty helpful, but nothing is going to cover everything that comes up. You need skills just like your loved ones. And there are things out there like DBT for families, and there's Families Anonymous and Al-Anon, which are groups not just for eating disorders, but they're very transferable for kids with mental illness or substance abuse. It's the same kind of concept. And then, of course, there's the F.E.A.S.T group that I run, and there's many other groups like that out there. And F.E.A.S.T has an insane amount of resources that I give out all the time that are wonderful. And, you can read a little bit about the FBT model because it does talk a lot about using leverage there. And I would always recommend individual therapy if you're having a hard time setting boundaries and using leverage because of your own feelings that are coming up. And then family sessions and family coaching is really helpful. I also tell people, if you have a friend who you see has an easier time setting boundaries with their kids and they still have a good relationship with them, talk to that friend. And maybe you can do some role playing with them, or you can pick their brain a little bit. But I would say don't be afraid of making mistakes. It's better to start small and take a risk than to feel powerless in the face of the eating disorder. Using leverage, no matter how you do it or how small, it has an impact because it's communicating to your loved one that something is standing up to my eating disorder. It's modeling that you can stand up to the eating disorder. It is not the most powerful thing in the room. And it shows your loved one that you're not so afraid of upsetting them that you wouldn't do what's right for them. And so I just wanted to now tell you about a few little communication strategies that I try to help people with. The one that's the most popular in the F.E.A.S.T group is called SET. And SET stands for support, empathy, and truth. And you have to use it in that order. So you would say something like, I see you battling the eating disorder the best that you can, as the supportive statement. I'm so proud of you for that. Next would be the empathy statement, where you're validating them. I see how difficult the struggle is, and I see that you're having to do this day after day, meal after meal. I can't imagine how hard that is. It sounds like, it seems like torture. And then finally would be the truth statement, and that is where you would introduce the leverage. And you would say, because the eating disorder has become so powerful, we're going to have to fight it by using some other things that are very powerful in your life as well. And therefore, in order to fill in the blank, go to the sleepover, participate in sports, eat lunch on your own, go to summer camp, use your phone, go to the football game tonight, you will first need to blank and then fill in the blank with whatever the desired behavior is. Complete the meal today, finish your snack, maintain your weight at the next appointment, take all your meds, go to and cooperate with your treatment team appointments, finish your meal in the 30 minutes of allotted time, add fuel for exercise, or finish your supplement. There's lots of behaviors that we might target. So whatever the desired behavior you want to see, you have to do X in order to do Y. And then with the non-dependent adults, the truth statement would be the boundary. You would just insert the boundary there. So basically, the message that you want to send is that the eating disorder recovery is more important than anything else in the world right now. It's the number one priority. It's even more important than their temporary happiness. I know you would be so happy if you could go to the football game tonight, but you have to eat this meal first. Your health comes first. If you communicate with seriousness and you're unwavering about, we are going to prioritize your health and your wellness first, and everything else will come next, your kids will hear that and they will take it seriously. They know the difference between when we really mean something and when we don't. My kids say, when mom says yes, when mom says no, she means no. And when dad says no, he means maybe. They know they can push him, but they can't push me. So you want to just convey that same seriousness that you would. And I tell people, be authoritative, but not authoritarian. And one trick I do tell parents is that, you can think about whatever it is that your kid is asking you to do. Imagine if it were something really dangerous, like they're saying, can I go to a party tonight where there's going to be drugs and no parents? You would say no. And they would know you meant it when you said no. So you want to use that same tone and feel that confident inside that what you're saying no to, even if it doesn't seem dangerous, it will be dangerous if they do it without eating and nourishing themselves and taking care of themselves first. So that becomes the most important thing. I think I've pretty much covered everything. The only one thing I'll say very quickly, Judy, that you had asked me to do is to talk about if there's ever a time you would not use leverage where it be, contraindicated. And I'll just say very quickly, if there's a medical concern, that has to be the priority. So if someone leaves a doctor's office and the doctor says you have to go to the hospital, there's a low heart rate, the kid can't now start promising you that they're going to eat 100%. They'll start right now. They'll give me my meal, I'll eat it. You've got to get them the treatment. They have to have the coverage for their medical care. And if somebody, maybe is cognitively impaired in some way where they can't understand the cause and the effect, it might not be wise to use it. And then if you have a really oppositional defiant kid, you might still need to use leverage, but it might not be that effective. So you might have to be 2 steps ahead and thinking about, what do I do when they knock down my boundaries? Because that's kind of what they do try to do. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
I'm open for questions.
This was an amazing presentation. We are totally out of time. We are not
Sorry.
going to take any questions, but I'm going to send you the questions, Efrat, that are in the chat.
Okay.
And maybe when
Okay.
you do the handout, you can just answer them then. There weren't
Okay.
that many. There were only like 3.
Okay.
So
I'm
thank you
happy
all
to.
so much for attending. Thank you, Efrat, so
Of
much for an
course.
amazing presentation.
Of
I just want to end by saying, if you like this webinar, if you enjoy FEAST services, if you benefit from them, and if you can donate, we are funded solely by the generosity of our own community. So just encouraging you to go to our website, make a donation if you can. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to remind everyone that our next webinar is May 14th, Too Much of a Good Thing, Understanding Exercise Addiction and Compulsive Exercise. It is also going to be an amazing webinar. So please tune in next month. Again, thank you so much, Efrat. Thank you all so much for attending, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Hello.